Yes, yesterday we discussed about working with material components and design. So how to work with these materials. So have you tried those material designs? Any one of you? Other than what we have learned, anything else you have tried? The materials, the components, anyone tried them? Other than what we have learned, have you practiced? So what we discussed, you were able to implement successfully. Yeah? What we discussed, the other things in the materials, were you able to do? So what about others? No response. All are awake only, na? Right. Fine. So next, after understanding, yeah, because that's on you. If you are not practicing, and generally we finish all the concepts step by step, and you are not practicing, thinking that at the end we can practice, it cannot happen. At that time, if you face any doubts, then nobody will be there to address. It is difficult once we finish the sessions again to get in touch regularly, right? I will provide you assistance, but it is good. Even the class is finished, I will provide you assistance, right? But if you practice immediately, then you have any doubts, then it will be better, right? So that immediately you can solve the issue and go to the next points. Huh? Okay, fine. So after understanding how to work with the components, all these days what we done is we we built components. So components, and we used built-in components. Built-in components. We used built-in components. Means ready-made components. We learned the communication between the components. So communication between components, how the communication happens. Next, after understanding that, you need to know another important point is the component cycle. So that is very important to understand. That is hooking into component life cycle. Component life cycle. So that means we need to understand various phases of component cycle and how to deal with them. Yeah, so in any another batch, that topic is not yet there, right? So whenever the topic comes, mostly it will take 2-3 weeks more to get into this topic in other batches, right? You can keep in touch with admin so that he will let you know. Huh? Whenever the topic comes, you can attend, no problem. Right. Right. So we need to understand the various phases of life cycle. That means generally to reduce burden on the application, a developer should know some important points like when to create connection. So with the APIs, so when to access data, when to send response. So when to uh, disconnect, disconnect, when to clean up. All such things a developer should exactly know. That means when you are using a component, you should know its phases, because at which phase, what activities to perform. That is very important to decide. A developer should exactly know about various phases of component, how it starts, how it ends, in how many phases it is having, in every phase, what activities to perform. Why? Because if any issue comes from the client side, generally in real time development process, client says that at this point, my application is slow. Other options are working fine, but at this point, it is slow. Like he says that it is loading fast, it is interacting fast, but when I go to some transaction, it is not so fast as expected, it is becoming slow. Then as a developer, we need to identify at which phase the component is becoming slow. In that phase, what activities are being performed and how we can reduce the burden in that particular phase to improve the performance of application. All such things are very important to know, very important. That is the reason if you are an experienced person and you are attending interviews on Angular, then several questions will be triggered based on this topic, on this topic particularly. So you should architecturally strong, you should be architecturally strong in understanding the various phases of component cycle, how it actually works and how it is done. I will tell you. So we will discuss about those points. If you thoroughly remember this process and understand, then I can guarantee that 30-40% of interview you can handle with only this topic. That means you can pass through the questions asked related to this Angular actually. So in Angular, these are very regularly asked. Let's see how it actually works. Actually, every component, so a component instance, usually a component instance has a life cycle, has a life cycle, life cycle. Every component instance have a life cycle. Actually, the life cycle starts when Angular instantiates instantiates when Angular instantiates the component. That means when Angular creates the component. That means you designed a component. The component lifecycle starts when Angular instantiates the component. It creates an object of that component. And actually, the life cycle continues with change detection. With the change detection, what is change detection? We will see. Continues with change detection. The life cycle ends. The life cycle ends when Angler destroys the component instance and removes from DOM, document model. So life cycle of component starts when Angler creates the component. So that means when client requests any component, Angler creates an instance of that component. And component cycle continues with change detection. What is change detection? I will tell you. And life cycle ends. So when the component we finished using the component. And important is Angler destroys the component instance and removes from the DOM hierarchy. Then the component ends. Actually, the component, so usually component creates, it updates, component updates and destroys instances. So all phases of component are maintained by a sequence of events actually. So all phases of a component are maintained by a sequence of events. What are those events? I will tell you. So these events are technically, these events are controlled with a set of methods known as hook methods. That is the reason people call this as often known as life cycle hooks. Life cycle hooks are nothing but the methods used for the life cycle. Actually, a simple point I will show here technically. Suppose we have index page. So just we have index page, some index.html page. Now in this page, actually we have a component. So we have a login component. So login component is defined with some functionality and design. This is the index component, index. Now, whenever in this index we have a login option and some register option, something like this. Now, the client makes a request. So the client makes a request. So for login, he makes a request for login. Click on login. Now, what happens usually is, so our Angular application will load this component into memory. So into memory, it will load this component. So this login component is loaded into memory. After loading into memory, that means the component is created. After creating, now it will process this component and it will send the component. It will process that component and it will send the component to the client. It will show the component to the client. It will send the component to the client. So generally what happens, actually we have a login component. Client requested it. This component is loaded into memory. From memory, this component goes to the page. Now, next step, what happens is, once user finished using this login component, then it is destroyed. It's all traces are destroyed from the memory. They are cleaned up. They are removed. They are destroyed. That means from the memory, it is clean. And here from the DOM, it is removed. So that means from loading to cleaning up, the process of loading to cleaning up, this process is known as, from loading to cleaning up, this process is known as, we call this mechanism as change detection. What will happen in the change detection? I will tell you. What will happen in the change detection? I will tell you. That means from loading the component, from creating the component to the destroying component, in between whatever happens is often referred as change detection. It is often referred as change detection. What happens in change detection? What is change detection? I will show you one example. We will see that. It is a very popular question in interviews actually, right? Generally, to understand all this, so another architecture I will show you, means that is the general basic architecture, how actually Angular starts working generally. Suppose we have HTML page, and that HTML page is index page actually. This HTML page, so we have a browser. Okay. When client requests that HTML page, so this page loads into browser. So first what will happen is it loads static DOM. That means document object model. It loads the static DOM. Why it is static DOM? Because so it loads the DOM elements, but they don't have any functionality. It loads the DOM elements, but they are static. They don't have any functionality. It loads the static DOM. Actually, this static DOM is loaded on an event called DOM content loaded. DOM content loaded is an event. This event is actually used by browser. Browser uses an event called DOM loads the static DOM. That means the static DOM is loaded. It loads this static DOM. So that means whenever a page is requested, this is the first thing happens. So it loads the static DOM content loaded. For example, I will show you the functionalities later. So in our project, so let's take this is equal to Amazon. Okay. First step. So that happens. I will show you when it is ready. We will see that. So this is the first option. DOM content is loaded. After loading the DOM content, so what happens is in the backend. So backend. So we have backend means don't think server side, right? In the background, right? We have an Angular library, Angular application. That means here the parent library is Angular core library, Angular core library. What happens is after the DOM content is loaded, the DOM content is loaded. Now the Angular library is loaded. Angular library is loaded. That means whatever the library is required for that page, that library is loaded. So that means Angular library is loaded. So that means first point is, so Angular core library is loaded. That means this library will be loaded. So after loading this library, so generally inside so many things will happen. I will just give a overview. Then what happens is it loads all the modules. So ng module will load all the modules. The library is loaded, all the modules are loaded. After all the modules are loaded, components are lazy loaded. How to load components lazily? You will learn in a concept called routing. Okay. Now modules are loaded. All the modules that you are using for application are loaded. After loading the modules, actually, technically, what happens is an injector comes into picture. What this injector will do is, so with the help of compiler, that means it uses a compiler. Currently our Angular is using, so AOT compiler. I already told you we have a JIT compiler also. So injector, what it will do is with the help of compiler, it will identify which component is requested and it will load that component. So and the component related library, it will compile. So that means it will compile and it will process. So injector will use this compiler. It will compile and process. Now, after compiling and processing, that means finally, finally the component is ready. That means now this component is using lot of functionalities, configuring the functionalities. Now this components and component uses a lot of events and all, you know that. After compiling and processing, now this component delivers. So this component is delivered to the HTML DOM. Now this time, this is transformed into a dynamic DOM. The static DOM is transformed into a dynamic DOM. Now our client will start interacting with our application by using this dynamic DOM. So that means what happens is technically, the static DOM is converted into dynamic DOM. Suppose it is successfully compiled. Okay, let's open any browser. And in the browser, let's open the local host. Okay. And let's open inspect element. In the inspect element, let's change the zoom level a little bit. Okay. Now you see here, so I will go to the network category and I will reload this page one more time. So it is making the request and loading everything. And actually, you observe carefully, it loads the content. And see, browser is using an event called DOM content loaded. On this event, it is loading the entire hierarchy to you. That means it loads the static DOM. So it loads the static DOM. After loading the static DOM, so that is just only one point I showed you, static DOM. Now you saw that already, you know that our application is loading all this library. Our application is using all this library. In this library, you can see there is a file called main.ts, main.js, sorry, right? This is main.js file. I will open that main.js file. Just for your understanding sake, I'm using it. Now this main.js file, you can see thousands of lines of code will be there. So what this main.css will do is, main.js file will do is, it will find the modules requested by the client. You can observe a small option is there, like error module not found. That means it is first looking for the modules, because main is the starting point, it is the entry point. So it is looking for the modules. You see modules, it is looking for the modules. So it will load all the modules. It will load all the modules. If any module is not found, it will show some errors. It will identify what are the dependencies required for the modules. What are the requirements for the modules. And you can't understand complete code of this. I'm just giving a point here. Now, what it will do is, it will generate the components. See, you see, it is loading these modules. So this is loading these modules. It is generating the components. It is generating the component. You see app component. So it is generating the components. That means which component currently required. Actually, we are not using any lazy loading technique. We are not using any lazy loading technique. So, and that's the reason you see all the components that you are using in your project. It is loading all the components. It is configuring all the components. This is one file which will inject everything into your application. Everything. You see all components related logic and functionalities here, including the scrolling demo. That means all the modules are configured here. All the modules are configured here. Everything that your application needs. This one file is injecting everything actually. That means actually what it is doing. So it is injecting everything. So it is injecting everything. So actually, so it uses inject, right? It is injecting everything. So the point here is, so the injectors are responsible for injecting everything into the environment. And you see here, this is what happens. This injector is responsible for compiling and loading the library required for the component and make the static DOM into dynamic. The process of converting a static DOM into dynamic DOM. The process of converting static DOM into dynamic DOM. The process of converting static into dynamic DOM. This entire process is usually called as, that means the process of converting static DOM to dynamic DOM is technically called as bootstrapping. Bootstrapping. This is called as bootstrapping. Bootstrapping is the process of converting the static DOM into dynamic DOM. Converting the static into dynamic. That's what actually called bootstrapping. So that is the reason. So you see in our app module.ts, you have an option, say bootstrap. Now don't get confused with CSS bootstrap and this bootstrap that we have, right? Bootstrap in Angular, here bootstrapping means it is the process of converting the static DOM into dynamic DOM. That means the static DOM element is converted into dynamic. So now it is asking for from which component I need to bootstrap. From which component I need to bootstrap. That means from which component I need to start. Which component you want me to convert into dynamic so that you can start interacting. That means from which, what is the starting point of interacting? That is what bootstrap is mentioning. So usually we keep only one here. You can, it's an array, you can keep multiple. But don't think that multiple will load, depends on lazy load. I will show you that. In routing, we will discuss about that. Means actually we load only one component. From there, we request all other components. We request all other components. User will stay on only one page and he will get access to everything onto that page. That is what actually the concept of single page applications, PA, right? So what is the meaning of this bootstrap? Why it is called bootstrap? You see, it contains a set of components that are bootstrapped when module is bootstrapped. What do you mean by module bootstrapping? What do you mean by module bootstrapping? Module bootstrapping is nothing but, so it is loading the component, compiling the component, processing the component, and converting the static component into dynamic. If the bootstrap fails, so that means, yes, generally that is the process of compiler, right? I told you already the compiling process, right? AOT compiler, JIT compiler. That's what we are discussing. So that is the process we are discussing actually. Now in this is a higher level cycle. In this cycle, this is a higher level cycle. In this cycle, every component have another cycle. Every component have another cycle. I hope you understand. In this, every component have another cycle. Temporarily, just I will keep you this just for your reference sake, the diagram just roughly. So, but this is not any official Angular architecture, right? Just a overview to understand the process actually. Now, the point here is technically is in this process, every component have a cycle. In this process, every component have a cycle and it will undergo several phases. That means from the time component created and from the time the component is removed from the DOM. That means the component that user requests, then what happens? Suppose user is requesting login component. login component. Then what it will do is it will create this component. After creating the component, it loads this component and adds to DOM. After user finished using this component, it removes from the DOM and it cleanups from the memory. It will clean up from the memory. So that means every component undergoes several phases. Every component have a cycle again. Inside the main cycle, every component have a cycle. And this component cycle is maintained by using a set of methods. So those methods are called life cycle hooks actually. So that means these methods are responsible for handling several interactions. What are those? What are those life cycle hooks, right? So that means, so the events, the life cycle methods used by component. The life cycle methods used by component. What are the life cycle methods? So used by component. Let's see what are the methods and how they actually work. I will create one table to understand how the component cycle starts. So let's classify this into, it is actually starting from a hook method, life cycle hook method, and purpose. What is the purpose of that method? That means every component undergoes several phases. In that, the first phase is the first life cycle method. First phase is actually, you can divide it into several phases. I will tell you. In the first stage, first phase, first method that executes for every component is ng on changes. Ng on changes. So that means this is the first method to execute whenever the component is created. So whenever the component instance is created, the first method to execute is ng on changes. You have to remember these points and hierarchy. So because in interviews they ask, what is the first phase of component cycle? What is the first hook method of component cycle? The first hook method of component cycle is ng on changes. Now, if an interviewer wants to know more from you about this, then he will ask, what happens in this phase? What is the role of this method? Okay, this is the first phase. This is the first event that fires up. What happens in that phase? That is the first question asked. First point is, what happens is Angular sets the value. So sets the value. And Angular binds the values to any property. It sets the value and binds the value to any property. It gets notified. It gets notified with the changes in values by using simple changes object, by using simple changes object. So actually it gets the previous value and current value. It gets the previous value and current value. And it includes loading any action performed by, that means it includes loading component and handling any action, that means event, you can say any action performed in application, any event or any action performed in application. So what happens in this phase? So the first phase is the on changes phase. Generally, what are the points here? I will tell you in a simple way to understand. Actually, what are the points here is in a TS file, and we have a HTML file. So in a TS file, so we have a property. We have a property name as some TV. So that is the property. And in HTML file, so we have a text box. Input type is text. And here the value is defined as a property. Value is defined as a property. And into that, we need to set this name. Actually, we written like this. Now, what happens is ng on changes. Ng on changes. That is the first event that fires up. What happens is this event, this method will first verify will allocate the memory. It will allocate the memory for name. So memory is allocated. After allocating the memory, it will render the value into memory. After rendering the value into memory, it will bind this property. So it will bind this to any DOM element. It will bind that property to the DOM element. That means ng on changes bind the property to any DOM element. It will bind to the DOM element. That means it sets the value. It binds value to any property. And this is having some event. So that means this text box is having some event. That means event like here we have key up is an event. So on this event fires up. Some method is called on that particular event. That means whenever the key up happens, this ng changes will get notified with that. And any change in the value, it get notified with that. And any change in the value, it will update back to this property. That means it identifies the changes. So actually, it uses an object called simple changes. This contains previous value, and it contains current value. The previous value is something like TV. And after that, they updated the value to Samsung TV. That means some change happened. It identifies the changes, update backs. That means you see one example, we learned about the option. So we saw about the option like, so in the square brace, ng model, and here we define name. Actually, this ng model is using two options, property binding and event binding. Already we discussed about that. This is under the control of on changes. So that means it is under the control of on changes. Initializing the value, loading the value, assigning the value to the properties, identifying the changes in the value, and updating changes back. All these activities are performed by ng on changes. That means the first phase in the component cycle the first phase of the component cycle is on changes. So if anyone asks what happens in this phase, what happens in this on this particular event, then simple, you can say that in this phase, the object is the properties are allocated with memory, assigned with values, binded with the properties in the elements, identifies the changes happened in that value, and update the changes back into the properties. All the property binding and event binding. That means you can simply say that. So ng on changes manages the property and event binding in Angular. This much in depth you will not may get anywhere in interview question, but so this is very high level technical answer. So what ng changes will manage in your Angular component cycle? So we have seen this type of question asked for more than 8-10 years experienced developers. Other than that, so very rarely we have seen this question asked by any interviewer, like what it manages. So in Angular application, so just role responsibilities they will ask, but if you tell what it can manage in the Angular cycle, that is great, good. That means it manages the property and event binding in Angular. That's what actually ng on changes. That means, see, experienced person, when he is answering any question in interview, he cannot go with explanation. Once anybody is explaining the answer, then we can understand that so he is not good experienced. Why? Because experienced people never try to explain the answers. That is only for fresher level people. Experienced people always hit the technical terms. They just explain the answer in one line, one word. They don't explain several points of meanings. That means this one line is experienced. A fresher will understand with all these points. That means these all points for a fresher to understand, but this one point is enough for an experienced person to understand. This should be the answer from an experienced person, and this should be an answer for a fresher level when we are dealing with interviews. Because according to your answer, they can calculate how much experience you may have in the concept, right? How much in depth you know about it. So explanations are not good every time. So you have to just hit the technical sentences, technical words. So ng on changes manages property and event binding in Angular. That is the good and correct way. And detailing how it does, I showed you the point. After on changes, the next important event method fires up is ng on init. Remember one point. All these methods are by default executed for every component. Even you don't write them, internally they are happening actually. Internally, all these events are firing up. They are working. Then why we have to write these methods? If we want some additional functionality to happen. For example, we have a class. We generally say that even you don't create a constructor, every class have a constructor. Then why you are creating another constructor if already it is having a constructor? That means we want some additional functionality to perform. Similarly, these all events by default work for every component. We write these events manually if you want some additional functionality to manage, right? That is what actually the purpose of this. We will see how to write. So after the data binding happened, property and event binding happened, the next important phase is this init phase. That means it will be called after the first after the first ng on changes, ng on changes. It will be called after the first ng on changes. So it will be called after the first ng on changes, right? Now what happens in this phase? It will initialize the directive or component after the first data is displayed. So it initializes the directive or the component. Technically what happens here is it initializes the directive or component. It will initialize the directive or component after Angular first displays the data bound to the property sets, data bound to properties at sets. That means what happens here is, in this phase, what happens is, after the data is bound, the data need to be kept in the memory for later purpose and later use. That means after the property binding happened, then what happens is, actually it initialized the memory. So memory initialized to handle values. So handle values between interactions. This is the high level answer actually. That means memory initialized to handle the values between interactions. It means that after the properties and values are binded, these values need to be initialized in the memory to handle the interactions. That means the value is present in the memory, and user is changing from one component to another component. That means now these values are present here. These values are present here. And the latest new value is Samsung TV. That is binded here. Now user is moving to another component. That means another component is coming here. Another component is loaded here. And this component is actually a child component. This is a child component. And in the main memory, actually in the main component memory, there must be the memory initialized for the child component, so that this data can be transported from the parent to child component. And data coming from the child component can be collected and used in the parent component. That means the transporting of data from one component to another component, keeping the data between the components. And this is all managed, keeping the data coming from any outside source. And this is all done in the initialization phase. That means actually ng on init. In the initialization phase, the data is bound with parent and child hierarchies. So one example I will show you typically. So what we need to understand here is, generally initialize memory, initialize memory. It will initialize memory for transporting data across components, and bind to. So parent and child properties. This is managed in the initialization phase. Current component related information is managed in the on changes. Data coming from external components, initializing memory for the components and handling the data for the component and using, exchanging the data, transporting the data. That is managed by using ng on init. ng on init. Now, very important is, sometimes what happens is the changes happening in component are not detected automatically. The changes happening in the component are not detected automatically. So if changes happening in the component are not detected automatically, then we have to manually detect the changes, what changes are happening, and we manually need to push the data, collect the data, just like we used on input and output parameters, because it is unable to transport the data by itself implicitly. Explicitly, we need to push the data by using the properties like input and output. That means if it is unable to manage and transport the data by itself, internally transporting happens within the component. Then outside the component, it cannot manage. Then another event will fire up, ng do check. What happens in ng do check? Actually, it is called, so immediately after ng on changes or every change detection, after every change detection, actually it will happen after every change detection. And also it happens immediately after ng on init. It happens on init, on its first run, actually on its first run. Generally, why we need this? Because it can detect and act upon, the changes that Angular is unable to identify by itself implicitly. That means you can say that Angular cannot or won't. So it cannot or won't detect implicitly. If it is unable to detect the changes implicitly, so then it will push them manually. Actually, it is very regular while using custom events. That means with input and output operations. That's what I said, input and output, with input and with output like functions. That means if the changes are unable to detect manually, implicitly, then explicitly we need to handle. You can say that this do check is for, in simple terms, you can change for transports, or transporting data. So transporting data between components. Transporting data between components is actually managed in this way. Remember, within the component, data transporting is managed by using init, because within the component implicitly it works. But between components, you say that memory is initialized, but transporting is not happening. Transporting happens through this do check. Do check identifies, are there any input and output functions? If there are any input and output functions, it recognizes them and it transports the changes between them. That is what actually happens in do check option. So the point here is we have on changes, after on changes init, and after init, do check. We have several more events to understand, but they will take a long time to understand. That's the reason I will give this in our next session. In our next session, we will discuss the other events and understand the complete cycle in one option. In the next session, I will just give you overview one more time of these events, and I will show you practically how to handle it. Because it is again a 1 hour session we have to spend to understand the complete other events also. Means what are the other events? Initially 3 events you understood. On changes is the first one, on init is the second one, do check is the third one. After that, what happens? Other things we will understand, and we will see practically how it works. That we will see in our next session, right? So in the next session on Monday, we will discuss about the other options and we will continue, right? No, tomorrow we don't have any class because tomorrow we have some workshops on AJAX and all. You better attend those sessions. They are very helpful for you people, right? Tomorrow we have a workshop on AJAX. You better attend that workshop, which is very helpful for you people, especially people who are dealing with Java, .NET, PHP, Angular